carried the smell of gunpowder long before the first shots were fired. America in the mid-1800s was less a united nation and more a simmering argument with a flag. On one side stood the industrial North, factories humming, railroads expanding, cities growing. On the other stood the agricultural South, its vast plantations powered by enslaved labor and deeply rooted in tradition. Between them lay a question that refused to stay quiet. Would slavery expand, or would it end? The tension didn't begin overnight. Decades earlier, compromises had stitched the country together like rough patches on worn fabric. The Missouri Compromise tried to balance free and slave states. Later, the Compromise of 1850 attempted to calm tempers again. But every compromise was more like a pause button than a solution. Each new territory acquired by the United States reopened the wound. Would it enter as free or slave? Every decision tipped the balance of power in Congress. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It proposed that settlers in those territories would vote on slavery themselves, popular sovereignty, they called it. In practice, it meant violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, determined to swing the vote. The territory erupted into chaos, earning the name, Bleeding Kansas. Armed mobs burned towns. Neighbors turned on neighbors. The argument had become physical. In Washington, tensions boiled over as well. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery speech condemning slavery. Days later, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina entered the Senate chamber and beat Sumner with a cane. The nation watched in horror, and in some cases, applause. The divide was no longer polite debate. It was personal. Amid this storm rose a relatively unknown politician from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Tall, awkward, self-educated, and sharp-witted, Lincoln believed slavery was morally wrong, though he initially focused on stopping its expansion rather than immediate abolition. In 1858, he debated Stephen Douglas in a series of public confrontations that drew national attention. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, he gained something bigger, recognition. The newly formed Republican Party opposed the spread of slavery into new territories. In 1860, they nominated Lincoln for president. His name wasn't even on the ballot in many southern states. When the votes were counted, Lincoln won without carrying a single southern state. For the South, that was the breaking point. South Carolina acted first, seceding from the Union in December 1860. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. They formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. Their argument was clear. States had the right to leave the Union, and they would protect slavery as their economic foundation. Lincoln,
For the South, that was the breaking point.
watched the country fracture. He believed secession was illegal. The Union, in his view, was perpetual. When he finally took office in March 1861, he faced a nation on the edge. The flashpoint came at Fort Sumter, a federal fort in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Confederate forces demanded its surrender. When Union troops refused, cannons opened fire on April 12, 1861. After 34 hours of bombardment, the fort surrendered. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. In response, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy. The border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware remained in the Union, though divided in loyalty. The map was drawn. Brother would fight brother. At first, many believed the war would be short. One decisive battle, they thought, and the other side would give up. Civilians packed picnic baskets and rode out to watch what they expected would be a quick Union victory at the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. Instead, chaos unfolded. Union troops advanced confidently but met fierce Confederate resistance. Reinforcements under General Thomas, Stonewall, Jackson held firm like a wall of granite. The Union line broke. Soldiers fled back toward Washington in disorganized retreat. The spectators who had come for entertainment ran alongside them in panic. The war would not end quickly. Both sides began preparing for a long struggle. The Union had advantages: a larger population, more factories, more railroads, and a stronger navy. The Confederacy, however, had experienced military leaders and fought defensively on familiar terrain. Many Southern soldiers believed they were protecting their homes from invasion. General Winfield Scott proposed the Union strategy, the Anaconda Plan. It aimed to blockade Southern ports and control the Mississippi River, squeezing the Confederacy economically and splitting it in two. Though mocked at first, This strategy would shape much of the war. Meanwhile, battles raged in the Eastern Theater. In 1862, Union General George McClellan launched a campaign to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Cautious and meticulous, McClellan often overestimated enemy numbers and hesitated to strike. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, newly appointed commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, proved bold and aggressive. In the 7 days battles, Lee pushed McClellan's forces away from Richmond. The Confederacy had found its champion. Lee's daring maneuvers inspired Southern morale and frustrated Northern leaders. But the bloodshed continued. At Antietam in September 1862, Union and Confederate armies clashed in the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Though tactically inconclusive, Lee's invasion of the North was halted. It gave Lincoln the opportunity he needed. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate-held territories were free. While it did not immediately free all enslaved individuals, it transformed the war's purpose. The conflict was no longer solely about preserving the Union, it was also about ending slavery. The proclamation also allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army. Thousands joined, fighting bravely despite discrimination and unequal treatment. Their participation strengthened the Union cause and added moral weight to its mission. Out west, Union forces made steady gains. Ulysses S. Grant captured Forts Henry and Donelson, securing control of key rivers. At Shiloh, a brutal 2-day battle shocked both sides with its high casualties. The scale of death made it clear, this war would demand enormous sacrifice. By mid-1863, the conflict had escalated beyond early expectations. The Union tightened its blockade. Southern resources dwindled. Inflation soared in Confederate cities. Yet the Southern armies continued to fight fiercely under Lee's leadership. In the summer of 1863, Lee decided to invade the North again, hoping a decisive victory on Union soil would force peace negotiations. His army marched into Pennsylvania. Union forces moved to intercept. They would meet in a small town called Gettysburg. Over 3 days in July, waves of soldiers clashed across fields and hills. On the final day, Confederate troops launched Pickett's Charge, a massive assault across open ground against entrenched Union positions. It was a disaster. The attack failed, and thousands fell. Lee retreated south. The Confederacy had suffered a devastating blow. At nearly the same time, far to the west, Grant captured Vicksburg, gaining control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was now split in two. The Anaconda Plan was tightening its grip. The war was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. As Part 1 closes, America stands battered and transformed. What began as a political argument over states' rights and slavery has become a full-scale war redefining freedom itself. Families mourn, cities burn, and the question that once simmered now blazes across battlefields: what kind of nation will emerge from the ashes?